Hi everybody, I'm Michael from Sew In Place and Sew and Sweep. This week for our Tech Tuesday, I'm going to talk about thread delivery on our sewing machines. This is a very important part of using your machines, and it's something that creates a lot of problems for a lot of different folks. Delivering the thread simply means getting the thread to the mechanisms in the machine with the least problems. So we have different types of thread spools available today, but literally they come down to two types of winds on the spool, if you will. We have the old style wind on the spool, which I call a stacked wind. This is like your typical old-timey spools like Coates and Clark used to have, and so on. And you can see that the thread is just wound up in a stacked way and back down. The other types of winds we have are what I like to call the cross wind. So the thread kind of crisscrosses the spool. I don't know if you can, you could see that fairly well on the screen there. So this is meant for higher speed delivery, and also is meant to simply fall off the spool. So the original design, like the stacked wind, is meant that the thread should spin off so that the thread doesn't twist off the spool, but rather is led off this way. Whereas we have the cross wind, and the thread is actually somewhat twisted on this spool, and so by pulling it off, it actually untwists it so that as it comes into the machine, it is quite flat, and that is the hope, that it's flat. But that's not always exactly what happens. So how do we deal with that? Some of the spools we see today could be very small, very large, or whatever. And some of the types of threads that we use today can actually hold the shape of the spool. They're literally on that spool so long, compressed around in a circle, that as they come off of the spool, we get little ringlets of thread off the spool. The problem with those ringlets is they get into the machine, these little kinks, and they actually end up sort of unthreading parts of the machine or causing issues, creating little knots in the thread and basically breaking in the machines. To help get rid of that issue, should that arise, you want to make sure you have one of these in your sewing room. This is a thread stand. They've been available forever, and they're very inexpensive. $10, something like that, $12. I'm not exactly sure. There's a lot of different prices, obviously, out there. But very simple concept. We set our spool on the little stand. We have, I call it an antenna, but we have this little thread guide at the top. And what this does is it allows this thread to sort of stretch out and release itself, to relax prior to getting to the sewing machine itself. That way, we don't have those little ringlets going into the machine. We simply have a nice, even thread that's being delivered into the sewing machine itself. That's very important. It allows us to also have higher speeds, which is great for your embroidery, your quilting, and so on. So I find that a thread stand is absolutely essential in your sewing room. When we think also, though, about these upright spools, most of the time you can get away with using them in the horizontal position, which allows that thread to simply fall off the spool, especially for polyesters and things like that. But if you're finding that you do need to use an upright position like this, and that's going to be more typical for metallic threads and things like that, please keep in mind that you are now literally changing the tension, because the machine now not only has to pull on that thread to create a tight stitch, but it's being pulled harder because the machine has to pull it off of the spool. So when we think of tension on a sewing machine, we think of two threads, top and bottom, doing a tug of war with each other. One's pulling and the other's pulling, and that should balance everything perfectly in the fabric. This is measured in a very light amount. It's 80 grams or so for the top tension. When we have to pull an extra 5 or 10 grams, that's a substantial change in our tensions all of a sudden. And it actually takes away the control of the sewing movement for the sewing machine. And so the machine can't be consistent because you're not providing 100% control with the machine. You're taking away some of that control by making the machine have a heavier weight prior to even allowing the machine to create the stitch. So the other thing is we want to have spool lead-offs, we call them. I've got a couple up here, and I've got a couple behind me. I actually set this away for a moment. So we have little caps when we put our spools on the machine, and these basically not only hold the thread on the machine, but they in essence protect the thread from getting tangled and harmed in the process. You know, you look at some of the old spools again, like the Coates and Clark thread, they may have a little catch on the end to allow you to put the thread away and not have it unravel. Well, that catch should be facing the other way, but a lot of times there can be damage. As you can see, my spool is actually chipped here. I can still use this spool. I simply put a spool cap on the end, which will then allow that thread to stretch out away from that damaged area on the spool itself. When we look at the sizes that we should use for each spool, just because I have a big spool doesn't mean I want to use a big cap like this. I'm going to look more at the end here. So I would personally use a small spool cap or spool lead off for this end to keep that from coming off the machine and to protect that end. The problem with putting something large here is that the thread can fall in between this crevice and get caught, and again break your threads, break needles, which inevitably will cause damage to your sewing machine. Any damage in the thread path is going to catch the thread, tear the thread, cut the thread, or whatever. So we always want to avoid that type of scenario. So once again, make sure you're using the right size caps. Make sure to have a nice little thread stand. If you're a serious sewer in your sewing room, you want one of these. They're just so good to have and so inexpensive. And if you have any questions, please write them in the comments section. I'll be glad to answer. For now, thank you, and we'll see you next time.